Thank you all very much for coming out this evening. Just one couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, if you could please turn your cell phones to silent mode. Secondly, we will be having a Q&A after the presentation, after Dr. Hinshaw's talk, but we'll be circulating with question cards to the group, so please flag somebody down. If you've got a question, jot it down, and we'll try our best to get to it in the Q&A period, especially if you write legibly. That makes it a lot easier. It is really my pleasure and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Stephen Hinshaw. Professor Hinshaw is professor and former chair of the Department of Psychology at UC Berkeley, and currently serves as vice chair for psychology of the Department of Psychiatry at UC San Francisco. This is a bit of a homecoming for Steve. He actually got his PhD here and did his internship in clinical psychology after completing his undergraduate training at Harvard, and before he went up to be on the faculty at Berkeley. Steve is primarily known for his work in developmental psychopathology, for his groundbreaking studies in ADHD. We had the pleasure of hosting Steve last year to talk about his work in ADHD. And he really has done landmark work looking at behavioral treatments for ADHD. He's received over $19 million in federal and private funding for his studies of ADHD and the comparison of pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic treatments for ADHD, which non-pharmacologic treatments working very, very well. He was such a wonderful speaker that we really wanted to have him back here to talk about another one of his areas of expertise, and that is the study of stigma of mental illness. This has been a long-time passion of his. He published a book, The Mark of Shame, which is just a wonderful academic discussion of the history and nature of stigma, and I know I'll be making ample reference to that and discussing that work with you tonight, as well as some more recent work that he's done in that area. He is really quite a prolific academic. He has published 12 books, over 285 publications. Couldn't you make it to 300?
Next week.
Okay, good, excellent. One of the 10 most productive scholars in psychology in the United States. And in recognition of his truly remarkable record of accomplishment, he received the James McKean Cattell Award from the Association for Psychological Sciences, the highest award given out by that organization in recognition of his lifetime body of work. So with no further ado, let me turn things over to Professor Hinshaw.
Thank you.
Steve?
Thanks, Marty. That's great. Okay, we've got a lot to do. We're going to start with a little bit of chalk talk about stigma and what it is, a little bit what it isn't, and then we're going to go to a much more personal narrative about my family, which got me involved in psychology and clinical psychology in the first place. And of course, because it's an academic lecture, we're going to end with a few lessons and take-home points, and that's our agenda. So, what is stigma? Literally, from Greek, like most psychological terms, it's a Greek term. This is a brand. It's a mark of shame or degradation or infamy. Back in Athens at the Agora, how would you know if the person you ran into was a slave or traitor? Well, there was a brand underneath the toga, a literal mark. Most stigma today is psychological rather than a physical brand. There's a lot of groups that over time and in different cultures get stigmatized, and I've listed a few up here. What's interesting is left-handedness, which was a high stigma for a long time, has changed. If you've not been under a rock for the last while, you'll know that attitudes in the country we live in about gay marriage have changed drastically within the last few years. But mental illness, along with homelessness and substance abuse, are the bottom three. The most stigmatized attributes, as we'll talk about, that the research shows and just examination of our culture shows, and we have a long way to go. So, what do social psychologists say about stigma? Well, part of this is not something inherently pathological. We all have to, just to negotiate a day socially, stereotype. I meet you, do you wear glasses? Do you have white hair like me? Are you old or young? Are you gay or straight? Are you, et cetera, just to negotiate the social environment. Now, I don't really engage in stereotyping as a Berkeley professor except against Stanford people, our arch rivals, a private school, filthy rich, kind of elite. So you notice maybe there's a kernel of truth in that stereotype, but I started to have an affective tone of not liking Stanford, so now I got prejudicial. What's prejudice? Prejudgment. It's the affective component. Stereotypes are cognitive, but now I don't like those Stanford types, UCLA, USC, name your out group. And in the progression, I may be likely to not ask or not allow any Stanford students into my classes at Berkeley. I might discriminate. We might steal the axe before the big game, even though we haven't won it. Stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and what distinguishes stigma, which is the sum total of all those, even more is, if I stigmatize you because you're in a certain group, everything about you is related to being in that group. It's very global. Your humanity, your individualism doesn't really hold up much anymore. So when I wrote the book that Dr. Luchter just mentioned, The Mark of Shame, I chose for the cover this painting by Hieronymus Bosch. This is 1495, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness. So there's a bit of a detail. This painting hangs in the Prado in Madrid, not up in Northern Europe where he painted it. And you can see that there's a surgeon with a scalpel, but the surgeon's wearing a wizard hat. That gives us an idea already about attitudes about mental health professionals back a few hundred years ago. The priest blessing the patient, looking somewhere off in the middle distance, surgeon's concentrating on the patient's skull, and the patient is the only one giving eye contact to us in a sort of plaintive, pleading way. So, the belief in Holland at that time was that mental illness was caused by a rock in your head. So the surgeon is extracting the stone of madness, the stone of folly, as it's sometimes called. Now, this is a many hundred-year-old painting, and this is a slide on PowerPoint, and it's hard to see, but if I had a pointer, you could see that there's a couple of little white things emerging from the patient's skull that don't look like a rock. They're, in fact, flower petals. Now, why did Bosch paint flower petals? What was the name for mental illness, the name that we might, psycho, crazed person today, use for mental illness back in Holland in the day? You were a tulip head. So Bosch, as the satirist he was actually portraying the surgeon extracting the tulip, the label from the man's head, and maybe if you took the label away, that might cure the illness. It's, what, a 600-year-old painting that's quite modern in its implications about what do labels do and not do. Are they empowering? Are they stigmatizing? We'll have a lot more to say about it. So what's the research evidence? So we will talk about this for the next hour. We'll have a break between 9 and 10. No, we can't do that. We got to go quick. So if you go with questionnaires where people write down their attitudes on 5-point scales, as I mentioned, mental health problems, substance abuse, homelessness, are rated the lowest in terms of attitudes. The social psychologist and neuroscientist at Princeton, Sue Fisk, who's done some social psych experiments and brain imaging studies along this line, says that people with these conditions, especially mental health issues, are the lowest of the low because they're judged as low in both warmth and competence. So you can do a 2x2, high warmth, low competence, et cetera, but mental health issues are generally viewed as you're not very warm and engaging and you don't do a very good job of things. And when you see images of people with mental illnesses or see the terms, what happens if you happen to be inside a brain scanner at that moment? Your insula lights up. The subcortical region that is heavily involved in the emotion of disgust. So it's almost as though the frontal lobes are bypassed. There's an automatic disgust module that might be triggered by people who are considered to be the lowest of the low. Now, more recently, people have said, social psychologists have said, well, people can fake questionnaire scores. What about your more unconscious, quick, snap judgment reaction times? And this is a big area of research. A few studies have been done suggesting that, not just consciously, but even unconsciously, a lot of people stigmatize mental health issues. Beyond quantitative research, what about if we were anthropologists and coming to our culture, what would we see about public attitudes toward mental illness? Well, you could just go to the state houses. In over half the states in the United States today, there is some combination of laws that says that if you're crazy enough to admit you have a mental illness, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, you cannot drive a car, you cannot vote, you cannot serve on a jury, run for office, and you automatically lose custody of your children. That's discrimination. Now, if I go to DMV and I'm 2200, uncorrected, don't let me get a driver's license. The disability is linked to the function. But because I was depressed 5 years ago, or had an eating disorder, or you name the diagnosis, I automatically can't do those things. This is policy. A lot of state legislatures are debating whether to change such outdated statutes. What does the media, or I should technically say, what do the media portray for mental illness? More accurate, more human interest stories, but what's the dominant news story? Just look to a couple of days ago, the mass shootings. That's the face of mental health and mental illness. So now in the formal lecture part, and your continuing education quiz will be delivered as you exit, so please study carefully. Why might mental health issues be so stigmatized? And I'll go very quickly. If you're out of your mind, insane, a lunatic, just think of those terms, your behavior is unpredictable. That might be threatening to me. There's something threatening, evolutionary and social psychologists say, about interacting with someone that you don't exactly know what they're going to do. And of course, the stereotypes are unpredictability, untreatability, etc. Attribution theory in social psychology is quite interesting. If somebody's behaving deviantly, and you are led to believe that this is because of a neurological illness, you tend not to blame them. However, the movement to say that mental health issues are the results of bad brains and genes tend to backfire. We tend to blame people less, but we lose hope for them, and we want to keep our distance from them. So mental health issues work differently from physical health issues in terms of attribution theory. If you ask a sociologist why there's stigma, well, it's because every society on earth we've ever studied has a hierarchy, and the people on top tend to blame the people below because it justifies their own having the goods they do. And mental health issues are often issues of economics and power. People with significant mental health issues are not making the good incomes and being in places of power in society. Maybe, just mentioning the media a minute ago, maybe stigma is the result of good old classical conditioning. If you are associated all the time with violent or incompetent images of people with mental illness, well, that becomes the sort of learning that you do about people with that condition. And I think most important, what do tyrants do? Dehumanize. Jews are vermin. People are only like animals in solitary confinement. When we dehumanize and take away essential humanity, this is when stigma has its greatest power. Andy Martinez was a social psych student at Berkeley, worked with him and other social psychologists to do one of the studies he published, the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, 2011, the first of several study article, and in the first part, people out in the world were given online paragraph vignettes about people with one word difference. The person suffered from a physical versus a mental health condition. With that one word difference, the people thought to have mental health conditions were rated as far less human on personality attributes. One word, major effect size. So the stereotypes and biases and discrimination exist. So two more important points. It used to be thought inevitable, it's not, but it's all too common. If I'm a member of society and I belong to a group that's stigmatized, and I've heard bedtime stories or scrolled the internet or done whatever, I probably have heard those messages and I probably start to feel that way about myself. Internalization of stigma, sometimes called self-stigma. It's not inevitable. African Americans in the United States today have slightly higher self-esteems than white Americans. Solidarity, black power back in the day. It's not inevitable, but it's likely, especially if you're in a group that you would never want to be a part of. Who, until recently, with the advocacy movements, NAMI, many other movements, had ever wanted to be known or recognized as being a part of a group with mental illness? What's important about self-stigma is that in pretty carefully controlled research, even if you take out of the equation the symptoms of depression or anxiety, the amount of self-stigma a person has predicts never getting into treatment or dropping out early if you happen to be in treatment in the first place, because you're not deserving. Of course, there's structural issues too, like health insurance and lack of parity, but internalized stigma may shy people away big time from getting the help that's needed. So here's a second term called courtesy stigma. So the famed Berkeley sociologist Irving Goffman published a book on stigma 52 years ago, and it's a wonderful little book called Stigma, and in it he talks about this pervasive tendency in society to stigmatize people around the stigmatized person. Now, he called this courtesy stigma. He was being sardonic. If you stigmatize me, it's only common courtesy to stigmatize my family and my friends and everyone around me. So it's sometimes today called associated stigma. Added to this, of course, is throughout most of the 20th century, who was blamed for having caused mental illness in their kids? Parents. Who lives closest with somebody with mental illness? All their relatives. Who works with people with mental illness? Shrinks. Social workers, psychologists. Professionals are in the shadow of courtesy stigma, which is a big issue for the field that will be the topic of our 11 p.m. session tonight. So, of course, with much better news coverage and much better attitudes and psychology courses offered in high school, mental illness stigma is really decreasing, right? Not so fast. The General Social Survey is an off every 5 years census type survey, and they've used the same kind of questions about vignettes of mental illness and attitudes for the last 50, 60 years, and there's been essentially no movement across that time. What has moved is knowledge. The American populace can tell you the symptoms of schizophrenia or recognize depression or alcoholism far better, but as knowledge has increased, levels of stigmatizing attitudes have stayed flat or even gotten worse. In fact, the American populace is 3 times more likely today than in the 50s to say that people with mental illness are violent. And guess why? It has to be the media coverage. It has to be the stereotype that the only newsworthy people with mental illness are the school shooters and the isolated males, some of whom, of course, do have mental illness. Never talked about is the fact that people with mental illness are much more likely to be victimized by violence than to perpetrate. So that gets lost in the shuffle. So these are some data that I've been presenting in a very quick fashion. Another approach to this is to say, what about personal experience? What is it like to live in a family with serious mental illness or to have it yourself? And the courageous introduction from Robin today gave us a sense of this. So what do we think about qualitative methods? Are they too soft and not representative and uncontrolled? Or do they set the stage for beginning to ask the right questions for the more quantitative empirical research we do? And I believe that, as you can see at the bottom, despite some of these, quote, validity flaws of narrative research, it has a lot to tell us about where we start looking in the first place. So with that in mind, I'm going to launch into a bit of a narrative. There's a couple of slides, there's more photographs that I think will be more informative than the slides. So I'm going to talk to you about my father, Virgil Hinshaw Jr., who was born in 1919 outside of Chicago. Now, as you can tell from his name, his father was Virgil Sr., and my grandfather was chairman of the Prohibition National Party of the United States from 1912 to 1924. And his work got the 18th Amendment passed. At family reunions, we often have a toast to the work of my grandfather. All 6 of his boys were liberal Democrats and drinkers, one actually with very severe alcoholism, so some things run in genes and some things are caused differently. 4 boys in the family, my dad was the 4th, and the first major risk factor in his life occurred when he was just over 3, when his mother, my grandmother, who had been a missionary to Central and South America, went in for surgery for ovarian cancer, and the bleeding was not controlled, and she died suddenly when my dad was 3 years and 3 months. So is losing a parent before the age of 5 a risk factor for the development of mood disorders? It turns out it is. Doesn't have a huge effect size. The quality of the relationships with the remaining family members and people outside the home is actually a stronger factor. It can be a protective factor, or it can add to the risk. So here's a photograph from the international newsletter, and I kid you not, called World Dry, the spring 1923 edition. And there was a long feature about Eva Pilz Hinshaw, my grandmother, and there was a photograph accompanying the article, and the title of this photograph is The Motherless Hinshaw Boys. So there's my Uncle Harold over on the right of the wagon, preteen, athletic, handsome guy who started drinking about a year after this photo was taken and died of alcohol poisoning in his late 50s. Talk about stigma to be the alcoholic member of the Prohibition family. In the wagon on the left is my Uncle Randall, who became an economist and was the chair of the Claremont Grad School Department of Economics for many years. My Uncle Bob, and then there's Junior, as he was called. All of the boys have half smiles. Junior has what the attachment theorists would call a pretty frozen expression. Letters written by my grandfather at the time said he would come home from his Prohibition work, and Junior was sobbing inconsolably for his mother, and the older boys tried to soothe him, but it was hard to get him to sleep. So there's something about losing a parent when verbal skills are still developing before the age of 5 that may be particularly difficult. So my grandfather decided to move the family out to California, and they finally settled in Pasadena, a good Prohibition town back in the day. My grandfather wouldn't recognize old Pasadena today at all. 2 more boys were born into the family when my grandfather remarried another missionary. What's this called when Prohibitionist Quaker guy falls in love with and marries stern missionary gals? Assortative mating. This drives the geneticists a little bit mad, because you would assume that genes are coming together independently, but they don't often come together independently. There's some selection in there, which throws off heritability estimates, etc. Nonetheless, my step-grandmother, who had been a school principal in Central America at a mission school, singled out Junior, the youngest of the 4 original boys, for very difficult and harsh punishments for minor infractions. And in the journals my dad wrote over the years that I saw many, many, many years later, he talked about the ritualistic, fairly sadistic nature of those punishments, and wrote pointedly at one juncture, we didn't have a word for it back then, but I believe I was a victim of what today might be called child abuse, in kind of halting phrase. And I won't go into the great detail. So here is loss of a biological mother and physically and even sexually abusive treatment at the hands of a stepmother, not a good early combination with whatever genotype Dad had. All 6 boys endured the stock market crash, onset of the Great Depression, FDR 33, happy days were here again, but not so much with the 21st Amendment for the Hinshaw family. But my grandfather had become president of the International Reform Foundation. He wanted to take Prohibition overseas. And my dad remembers as a teenager a lot of Prohibition international visitors coming out to the Pasadena dinner table and talking about what had happened in Italy and in Germany with the fascists and Nazis having taken over. And Dad was quite worried about this, but never seemed, as a Quaker pacifist family, what could they do? Until just before the start of his senior year out at Pasadena Junior College and High School, he began to get preoccupied with the Nazi threat, couldn't sleep for 3 days consecutively, and started wandering the streets and the sidewalks of Pasadena. And on that third night, the idea, he said, why had I never thought of it before? I can stop the Nazi threat because I now, if I spread my arms, have the power of flight. So he'd quickly become floridly psychotic. He was out all night, climbed up the trellis of the home in Pasadena, which still exists out on Oakland Avenue, went up the porch roof, and took his first flight. How long did it last? A second and a quarter. He broke his wrist. He was bleeding from the head. The older boys, the older brothers, rushed out. The parents were out of town at a prohibition meeting, got him to LA County Hospital, and then 2 weeks later to Norwalk County, now Norwalk State, one of the few state hospitals left in California, with a diagnosis, of course, of chronic schizophrenia because he'd been psychotic. The United States didn't really do much diagnosis of bipolar affective disorder from about 1915 till about 1970. He stayed at Norwalk for 5.5 months, and what was his treatment? He was tied and then sometimes chained to his bed at night to prevent wandering. No medication, no psychotherapy, no school. He was on the garbage crew some mornings. Self-image is shaped by difficult hospitalizations when you're a teenager. He got better in early March, and the staff said, we don't know what's happened, but we're going to discharge Mr. Hinshaw. He went back to Pasadena Junior College, started the next Monday, 12th grade, got straight A's for both that semester and the semester before, and what did the family discuss? Nothing. They didn't want to jinx it. And what was the outpatient treatment plan? What was the medication, psychosocial? Obviously nothing. So the family didn't know what had happened. Uncle Bob, the one in the middle, my dad's brother Robert, was the first one out of the home to witness Junior on the sidewalk below, and told me that day, he told me later, that on that day he decided to become a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and he did, and worked with people with mental health issues the rest of his life. A couple years later, Dad was valedictorian at Pasadena Junior College. Here's his valedictory photo. He was a speaker at the Rose Bowl in front of about 60,000 people. And at that point, even though he was euthymic and very healthy, he made a very difficult decision. He'd had a full scholarship offered to Stanford and Berkeley, but decided to go to Stanford, which I never quite forgave him for doing, and decided to double major in philosophy and psychology, the big issues of the world and the mind. Now, why didn't he end up a couple of years after that with his BA overseas? Because the family was conscientious objectors, being Quakers and pacifists, and because he had a 4F because he spent 5.5 months in a mental hospital. So he went to graduate school at Princeton, studying philosophy. Randall was a grad student in economics at the time. Bob was a grad student in psychology at the time. They were all there together on the campus. And Dad was told by the department chair his first year that a visitor was coming over from overseas, and the department had arranged a one-on-one tutorial with him every week for that year. And Dad said, well, who is that? And he said, oh, a fellow named Bertrand Russell. So Dad had a tutorial for Russell for the year. And then during his last year of grad school, he was introduced over across the street at the Institute for Advanced Studies to a physicist named Albert Einstein, and contributed a chapter on Einstein's social and moral philosophy for a sort of physics tribute to Einstein. He had good mentorship in grad school. I loved UCLA for grad school. I had great mentors, but I didn't have Russell and Einstein. So nonetheless, within a month after completing his dissertation, in the winter of 1945, he was starting to believe that he could predict the end of World War II through ESP and telepathy. His girlfriend wasn't sure she wanted to stay with him. He took the train up to New York and banged on her door in the bitter cold. The police came and shipped him off to Philadelphia State Hospital called Byberry. Byberry is in the country, it was in the countryside, it's now in sort of suburban Philadelphia, and the treatment there was a little bit better. He got some insulin coma therapy, but both staff and other inmates there sometimes would take him into an old physical therapy room and beat him if he talked against certain religions, which people who were manic or sometimes get very religiously preoccupied. 6 months later, he was released, went back here to Southern Cal, had a PhD in philosophy, several publications, got accepted for a job teaching philosophy at Ohio State, where he was a professor for the next 49 years. Met my mother, a grad student in history. Mom started to talk to me years later, the way Dad did, and what did she say that her soon-to-be husband said about his history? I had a little trouble in high school and at Princeton. That's internalized stigma. Do you want to tell your fiancé about your schizophrenia and your psychosis and your insulin coma treatments and being beaten in a hospital? So when did Mom begin to understand? When she became pregnant with me and then with my sister. Floridly manic episodes during both of those pregnancies. It's known, of course, that women, often with a history of mood disorder, in pregnancy, postpartum, affective illness is a big risk. It's less known that for men whose partners become pregnant and deliver, and they are on the bipolar spectrum, the partner's pregnancies can be triggers for their own episodes. Harder to come up with a strict hormonal theory, right? Existential fear, lack of sleep, prohibition against sex, all of those things have been talked about. Now here's a photograph of all 6 of the boys. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this photograph and then try to wrap up the narrative a little bit. This was taken right around the late 40s, early 50s, when they were all back in Pasadena. A little bit of history and genetics lesson here. So over on the left is Uncle Harold. Remember, he was kneeling beside the wagon. He was a golf caddy, didn't have good jobs, drinking plagued him his whole life. There's Randall, the economist, a little bit shorter in stature than the others. He developed rheumatic fever when he was 12. They didn't have any treatments. The doctors ordered him on bed rest in Pasadena for that year. And so I asked him, well, what did you do during that year? He said, well, I didn't want to lose my education, so I read the Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z. That's an academic coping strategy. There's Uncle Bob in the plaid, who was in his residency at USC Medical School. He'd gotten his PhD at Princeton in psychology. He, like all the boys you see, and like me and all the boys and men in our family, had very severe migraine headaches starting when he was an early teen. His were probably the worst. He started to prescribe himself barbiturates, started to later inject, and then way too early injected enough that he lost his leg and died of kidney failure. So substance abuse. There's Junior in the white t-shirt. I didn't mention that when he had been at Norwalk, he had believed that there was a continuing Nazi plot to poison the food, so he went from 180 pounds to 115 and almost died from starvation. Well, obviously here he's gained his weight back, looking very robust. And then there's the 2 half-brothers, the products of my grandfather and step-grandmother. They're both under 30, the other guys are over 30. They both are getting bald. The other guys have full heads of hair. Baldness is a sex-linked trait passed on by the mother. Uncle Harvey in the sweater vest was an Ives interpreter on the piano and a professor of music at Nebraska. Paul, over on the far right, was a soloist with the LA Master Chorale for 47 consecutive years. So music. Harvey's firstborn son, Harvey Jr. Chip, developed schizoaffective illness and shot himself in the chest when he was 30. Paul's firstborn son, Marshall, just 2 years older than I, dropped out of Cal after the first quarter, when Cal was still in the quarter system back then, and has had schizophrenia for 47.5 consecutive years. So on the step-grandmother's side of the family, baldness, musical ability, and schizophrenia spectrum disorders, anxiety, mood, and alcohol problems, doesn't always breed true, but our family history is quite something. So, here's a picture, spring break down in Florida, little skinny Stevie with his big, robust philosopher dad. But what was happening during that first decade of my life? Dad would disappear from time to time with very severe manic and mixed episodes and sometimes depressions. He was the 4th patient in the United States to receive Thorazine. His brother Bob heard about this new medication from France and got Dad on the fast track for it. Many ECTs he received at Columbus State Hospital and at Southern California Psychiatric Institutes at the time. What were my sister and I told when Dad would come back 3 months, 6 months, or a year later? Nothing. I once got bold in 3rd grade. Dad was gone for 11 and a half months, and we weren't allowed to talk about these things, so I asked, Mommy, where's Daddy? And she said, your father is resting in California. It's best if you ask no questions. The psychiatrist had told my mom and dad in one of the few actual couple sessions they had that if my sister and I ever learned of my father's mental illness, it would permanently destroy us. So silence was the doctor's order. What do kids do when something's not going so well at home or in their life, but nobody talks about it? Internalize. It must have been me. If only I'd been a better son, maybe Dad wouldn't have gone. Maybe if I really keep quiet, he'll come back sooner and won't go away again. So part of the transmission of serious mental illness is, of course, genetic, and part of it is in the family communication patterns that accompany whatever genetic liability there is. Let's see if I can get to the right slide here. When did I learn what I'm telling you about today? When I went off to my freshman year back east to college, came home for my first spring break to Columbus, Dad pulled me in his home study and said, son, perhaps you might learn about something of my history. I had just turned 18. I wasn't a kid anymore. I think maybe he felt he wasn't going against doctor's orders because I wasn't a child. And I began to learn in 3 to 4 to 5 conversations a year every time I returned to Columbus about the events I've told you about tonight. The next year I decided to become a psychology and social science major. What a shock. Lots of people in the field are motivated by difficult personal or family experiences. But at the same time, what did I think when I had trouble sleeping at night? I'm next. What did I do in notes? I took biology from E.L. Wilson at Harvard. It was a great experience. But I stopped taking notes about what the professors were saying and started drawing little circles and squares and trying to make genograms. What was the pattern? Was I next? When you learn very quickly about things that you might have been talked about in a more gentle and supportive way early on, and when I wasn't talking with anyone else about it, was I going to tell my roommates or girlfriends that my father was schizophrenic and that I probably was too? Silence breeds silence, stigma breeds stigma. Really good education at Harvard, but wasn't a fun-loving 4 years of college. Worked for 3 years. I identified with kids who were kind of lonely and in trouble with serious developmental disabilities at a school program in Boston, at a residential summer camp run by Bruce Baker, professor of psychology right here. And when I came out to grad school to UCLA, worked with Bruce and several others in developing my program of research, and was an intern right here at what now called SEML, what used to be called NPI, and took the affective disorders rotation with Kay Redfield Jamison, who taught me a lot about mental health and mental illness and resilience. And Dad got to know Kay when he would visit me out here. In fact, by that time, he was on lithium, because I had gone the year before grad school and driven across country to meet with my Uncle Bob, who was failing in health then on dialysis 3 days a week. And he said, I think I've kind of lost touch. Do you mean they're still diagnosing your dad with schizophrenia? Well, let's call his psychiatrist. And we did. And what did his psychiatrist in Columbus say? I've just been to a continuing education workshop. I've learned about bipolar illness. I think I've been misdiagnosing your father, your brother, for the last 20-some years. So Dad got on lithium for a few years before some renal issues prevented his dose from being too high. And finally, he owned that he had a biologically based mental illness. A couple of more pictures. This is right after I got my PhD from UCLA. Mom and Dad and I drove up, and my sister was with us, to Santa Barbara. This is El Capitan Beach. That's actually me with the mustache. What did my wife say when I met her? had the mustache still. Steve, you know the 70s ended a long time ago. It was a very moving conversation we had. And so here's Dad in his mid-60s, little punch, pretty robust, full head of dark hair, not everything's genetic. And here he is 5 years later, my first faculty appointment at Berkeley up at Stinson Beach in Northern California, and he's lost 25 pounds, and he started to hunch and was walking slowly and developed a fine tremor and developed a Parkinson-like illness that essentially killed him a few years later. Only one other case of Parkinson's in the family, not a completely penetrant genetic disorder, did all of the wrong medicines and all of the ECTs back in the bad old days when ECT wasn't what it is today contribute to a neurological decline? I'll never know, but accurate diagnosis and responsive treatment are a big part of the picture. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to get to some other points, but I'm going to tell you one more story. Remember, let's go back a picture or three. Uncle Randall, the economist, in the spring of 1945 was working in Washington, D.C. for the Federal Reserve Board and got a call from the graduate dean at Princeton that his younger brother, who was still a graduate student, had just finished, had been taken to Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry with a terrible mental illness. And Randall petitioned to the general who ran his office to get a gas ration card and he worked 6 days a week. On the 7th day, on Sundays, he drove up, this is before freeways, up to Philadelphia to visit his brother at Byberry. He said, maybe if I took good progress notes, it might get his early release. He was in that Norwalk hospital for way too long. And a couple of months later, the staff had said, we're noticing a little bit of improvement in your brother, and Randall asked to get a day pass to take him out, first time he'd been out of the hospital, for lunch. But in the car, my dad started translating the road signs into German. Randall said, well, Junior, what's the meaning of this? We're in Philadelphia, we're going to go out for a nice lunch. My dad would hear nothing of it, switching back from German to English, and finally said, I'm being held in a concentration camp in Germany or Poland. The guards have detected my escape. Take me back immediately. So Randall thought, well, so much for this week's progress notes, and there was no talking any rationality into his brother, and they returned. Some years ago, as I was doing some of the legwork for the book, The Mark of Shame, I came across a book by Gerald Grob, G-R-O-B. He's a medical historian at Rutgers. The book's called The Mad Among Us, A Social History of Mental Hospitals in the United States. And fascinating book about, from the colonial period on, how mental hospitals evolved. But I was tired reading one day, and you've never done this. You go to the photographs in the middle section of the book, right? Old lithographs of Benjamin Rush, Pennsylvania Hospital, flipping through to the 20th century, and I looked at a caption. Above is a photograph of one of the men's dorms at Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry in 1946. It's like, wait, my dad was just there a few months before this. Readers should note that Philadelphia State Hospital was known as the worst mental hospital in the United States. 7,000 men and women in capacity for about 3,000. Beatings and deaths routinely reported. And all of a sudden, and then you looked at the photograph, and it looked triple bunks, sterile, looked like the life photographs of the liberation of the camps. It had that same feel. There were no men. They were taken for Life magazine. And all of a sudden I thought, maybe Dad's discussion of what happened at Byberry and the beatings he got and the delusion he was held in a concentration camp wasn't entirely delusional. What were Hitler's goals? To rid the earth of gays, lesbians, Jews, gypsies, mental defectives, imbeciles, right? And if you go online now, you can look at some historical, they tore down Byberry about 25 years ago. And it's an online kind of a slideshow and photographs and articles and smuggled journals from that institution. There's a concentration camp feel. That's what we did to treat major mental illness for far too long in this country. Of course, now we've closed them all down and people are on the streets and in jail, and we haven't funded community alternatives. But it gave me an appreciation that even people with very serious mental illness We want to treat their hallucinations and delusions. We don't want the toxicity of these experiences to taint their brains, but everything they say may not be as crazy as we might think. So, a couple of concluding points. I don't think I need to tell the friends of Semel that mental illness is real, but still look at many op-eds and many opinion pieces in the blogosphere. There's still very prevalent stigma. It's still not talked about. The United Kingdom has embarked upon 2 major nationwide anti-stigma campaigns. The first one was called from 98, or I'm sorry, it was 98 to 2003, Every Family in the Land, because the epidemiologists were right. Mental illness doesn't affect just a few selected families. It's everywhere. Obviously, some families more than others. I've mentioned a couple of times, what would it have been like had Dad been diagnosed more accurately and treated better? Well, back at Norwalk in the fall of '36, I don't care what his diagnosis would have been, he would have been chained to his bed. If there's only one treatment, it doesn't matter what your diagnosis is. Diagnosis is being considered very carefully these days. Is the DSM a good thing or misguided? Do we go to the research domain criteria? Do we go back to a dimensional system? Whatever we do, we still have to classify people, and the more accurately, the more specific treatments can be. Dad was a great father. I didn't tell you about when he was back and I couldn't sleep and was scared. He was the one that comforted me. Mom was sleeping because she had to care for the family single-handedly during all his absences. What helped Dad be a great teacher and a great philosopher despite what he'd been through? Sense of humor, work ethic, religious upbringing, and he was a professor. He had tenure. How many employers would have kept him on given what he did on campus and with his episodes? It's pretty hard in Western society to make it back after a serious psychosis that takes you off that educational and vocational merry-go-round. Last few years of his life, Dad told me once that he wished he'd had cancer. I thought, oh my God, is Dad relapsing? He hasn't been on his lithium now. The dose was low and it was a bit toxic. And he said, but son, don't you understand? Cancer is a real illness. My whole life I've had a mental illness. Think what that means to a philosopher, son. It means it's mental. I made it up. Maybe it's just a figment of my imagination. How I long to have a real illness. If I didn't learn about stigma before, I learned about that out in Palm Springs in my mom and dad's condo in the spring of 1993. Another time, he'd visited me when I was a grad student out here. I lived in Venice, where the debris meets the sea. I know it's a hip place, right? And I was here. I was actually at the internship. And Dad went to a cafe one day when I was working hard. I came back and said, well, how was your day? And he said, Venice is an intriguing place, son. He said, I went to a cafe for lunch. And there were some pretty interesting characters, I can tell you. I said, well, tell me more. He said, well, as soon as I sat down, there was a table of 4 over there, and I could tell instantly that they had all been in mental hospitals. And I said, Dad, how did you know? They weren't wearing badges. What was going on? He said, a psychotic like myself, I can spot him a mile away. But that was his image. He was a psychotic. He was flawed. He deserved the punishments he got because they were so linked to the abuse he got. All the learning he did, all of Jameson's seminars, all of Monskow, the famous Danish psychiatrist who did the first lithium studies, whom Dad heard lecture, went only skin deep. He knew inside that he didn't have a biologically based illness. He knew inside that each episode was a deserved punishment for a moral failing. This is what overcoming stigma will do to get responsive care and treatment early in people's lives. What should Mom and Dad have told Sally and me? Anything. So Bill Beardsley is a child psychiatrist, head of Children's Hospital Psychiatry in Harvard Medical School, Children's Hospital, and I can't believe this form of family therapy hasn't caught on more. He published a book on this in 2002. He's developed a form of family therapy, a 16-week course of it, for families in which one or both parents have either unipolar or bipolar illness. Now, the parents have to be in treatment. They have to be getting medicated and have an individual therapist. The family therapy has several goals, but the most important of which is that the parents work with the therapist to create a narrative to tell their kids about the episodes. And of course, what do the parents do? They've signed the contract, they know they're in this treatment plan and study, and week 5, the kids are in the playroom, and the therapist comes in and says, now we start to build that narrative. And the parents say, what are you talking about? I'm never going to tell my kids. It's the most shameful thing of my life. But over the next weeks and overcoming resistance, the therapist works with the family to tell in language that a 7-year-old girl versus a 13-year-old boy might understand about mom's absences or dad's temper or the drinking or what have you. After 16 weeks in 2 randomized trials, the kids who receive this style of family therapy, a kind of narrative therapy, versus kids in pretty active control groups of other sorts of family therapy, they're doing a lot better. Better adjusted, better grades, etc. That's good. 4 years later, when these kids are now teens or the teens are now young adults, their risk of developing a mood disorder is cut by 50%. Genes transmit 30 to 40% of the variance in unipolar depression, about 80% of the variance in bipolar. Some of the remaining percent is in family communication and preventing internalization. Communication is an active treatment. What can we do about stigma? I'm involved in one of the many things I'm doing now in a program called Let's Erase the Stigma. Started down here in LA. We brought it up to the Bay Area. These are high school clubs, not therapy groups. First week of school, rugby club, chess club, Latin club. I don't think any schools have Latin clubs anymore, but in case they did. Or the Let's Club, the Let's Erase the Stigma Club. So kids volunteer to become a member of a club with not much of a curriculum, just some guideposts, to discuss gay, lesbian issues, bullying, difference, mental health issues. And they design what they're going to do in their communities and schools to help other kids get involved to eliminate stigma. The first study we published, Nicole Merman's senior thesis at Berkeley a couple of years back, published last year, showed mild gains in knowledge. This isn't a health curriculum teaching the facts about mental illness, but bigger and impressive gains in attitudes, intended behaviors to reduce stigma, and in reducing social distance, wanting to be closer. Attitudes about gay marriage have changed for what reason? People under 30, radically changing their attitudes. We need to get mental health in the open discussion. I think we should be doing these clubs with middle schoolers, not just high schoolers. If we open the discussion, just in the way the narrative family therapy, just in the way my sister and I didn't hear, and bring mental health to the forefront, we'll have to fund it better. We'll have to demand that under a third of people with serious mental illness get any psychiatric care at all that's remotely evidence-based. And for kids, it might even be lower. It's 2015 in the United States. We should be doing a far better job, and we're not. And I think the main reason remains stigma. So on that note, I think it's time for some questions. Okay? Now, oh, thank you. So are we going to do this by cards, or are we going to get some from the floor?
We're going to get some cards up here.
Okay, great.
I'll take things off for a moment. Make yourself comfortable.
I will.
Thank you, Steve, for just a wonderful talk and for sharing your personal story with us. Hearing you talk about stigma and some of the statistics about mental illness in this country, it's almost hard to believe that there is as much stigma as there is. 15% of the adult population suffers from major depression. 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 individuals in this country suffers from a major mental disorder. Everybody in this room, most people in the country are touched in one way or another, yet despite the fact that it's a personal experience for many people, it's still kept in the closet. It's still shameful. So how do you reconcile
you don't have to be a member of a rare minority group to be stigmatized. 51% of the population are women. Is there still stigma? Is there still sexism? Yes, of course. One strategy that some people have suggested is, let's make the epidemiology more public. Look how many people with the statistics Andy just cited have mental illness. That's like everybody, but it seems to backfire. Yeah, but they're the exception that proves the rule. Yeah, but gee, I've been kind of sad and down too. I don't stay home in bed. I get up, and there's a lot of resistance because I think of this threat. It's not just threatening physically, but if you're not so sure about how you're doing mentally, and then you encounter the fact of someone with a mental illness, maybe my grip on, quote, reality and myself isn't as strong as I thought it was, and you want to push it away. So another aspect of stigma that I didn't have time to talk about is some stigmas are pretty overt. Hard to hide the fact that you have a major physical disability, you have a different skin color from the majority. Other stigmatized attributes are potentially hideable, concealable. Have I had depression or bipolar disorder? What about my family? It turns out that these concealable stigmas, you think, well, they're concealable. You can kind of fake it, no problem. Every minute you're wondering if it's going to leak out. The anxiety in interactions is intense. So concealable stigmas, and again, maybe the fear of where but for the grace of God go I, make the sort of numbers not as relevant as they should be in fighting stigma. We got a lot of work to do. But I think you've got some index cards.
I do, I do. But while I look over them, I'll give you one other question.
Okay, good.
You talked a little bit about, excuse me, violent crime and mental illness. And, you know, as you rightly pointed out, the mentally ill are far more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators. There is a move afoot, actually particularly since the Santa Barbara shooting last year in this state and in other jurisdictions as well, to say if you have suffered from a mental disorder in the last 6 months, in the last year, whatever, that you should not be granted a right to buy a firearm. Now, forgetting about the whole issue of what kind of gun control we should have in this country. In general, do you think that's a reasonable, a sensible restriction from your perspective?
So my feelings about gun control are not terribly informed, except that we've got way too many guns around. And I want to put it in a bigger context. How did my dad get in mental hospitals when he was younger? A psychiatrist would write a paragraph, a judge would read it, write an order, and he was in Columbus State Hospital or state hospitals here or Philadelphia State Hospital. And of course, how long was his sentence? Indeterminate. He wasn't out until the doctor said he was better. So what have we done in the last about 40 years? Every state now has very restrictive involuntary commitment laws. Lanterman-Petra Short Act in California, danger to self, danger to others, gravely disabled, the only way. So first of all, people now recognize that people with mental, those are those dangerous people. So that might be fueling some of this. Second, so peak year for mental hospitalization in the United States in public mental facilities was 1955, about 600,000 Americans. And last year, about 35,000. That's a 93% reduction. We've closed the places down. So where do you go? On the streets or to LA County Jail or San Francisco County Jail, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't have alternative care. We have not funded, despite the great efforts of John Kennedy and many others, for community mental health. We end up with the sort of portrayal of mental illness before our eyes with muttering people on the street and the fear of violence. There are, if you're psychotic to the point where you believe other people are controlling your mind, there's a tendency towards violence. Antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, that's linked to violence. Alcohol and substance abuse is clearly linked to violence, but every other form of mental illness is not. But the stereotype is, it's everybody. So it's a rambling answer to a very difficult question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One question that came up toward the end of your talk, you were speaking about family therapy and ways to communicate with children that was actually very therapeutic. Fascinating data that you showed. One question we have here is, how do you recommend talking with children about a parent's mental illness in a manner that wouldn't make them more anxious?
Yeah, I mean, so the point of Beardsley's work and my experience is not, well, let's show kids how disturbed mom or dad can be. It could be terrifying, could be traumatizing. Beardsley's point is it doesn't matter precisely what you say as long as it's accurate and honest and geared to the child's developmental level. So I don't know, I mean, somebody asked me once when I first got into this area what my parents should have told me, and I was so shocked by the question. It was so silent back then, I can't even imagine what could have been said. But probably anything that, in the language of a 5-year-old or 10-year-old or 15-year-old, grounds it in reality, especially if there's treatment involved, gives the kids some hope, and makes the kids stop wondering, A, what's going on, and B, what did I do to make this go on, is going to help bind. Communication binds anxiety. Communication gives an outlet. So I'm sort of ducking the question by saying, I don't know the right thing to say except saying something, and often working with a professional to say the most sensitive things that the kids can understand is going to be much more helpful than shame and silence.
Right. Yeah. Would you recommend family therapy in many instances?
I think in many instances, I mean, what do we know about, say, bipolar illness? Most of the recommended treatments are pharmacologic. This is a pretty intense condition that you need to get control of. What are the rates of medication non-adherence for bipolar? Astronomical. You need psychosocial supports, often group support, to motivate people to stay on medications. You need family support so they can understand the chaos in the life that's gone on before and maybe prevent it again. And I think Beardsley's is the one form of this family therapy where there's an active attempt to talk to the kids about what's going on. So family therapy, I think, is a big part of the treatment plan.
Great, thank you. We have kind of one question here that's sort of the flip side of stigma, if you will. I mean, you know, obviously you come from a family of very high achievers, people of very high intelligence, even if one did go to Stanford.
That's right. Mistakes were made.
Hey, listen, guilty by the way. But one question here is, what is the relationship between intelligence, IQ, creativity, and mental illness? I mean, it's a difficult question, but it's kind of the flip side of stigma, that is,
right.
Much is written about
right.
Creativity in mental illness, high intelligence, emotional sensitivity. What are your thoughts on sort of the flip side of the question?
A great topic for a midnight seminar tonight. It's a big issue. Most forms of mental illness are equal opportunity conditions, but they're somewhat associated with having socioeconomic deprivation. That kind of makes sense. The big exception is bipolar disorder, which is the only major form of mental illness positively associated with income. So what's driving what? Are creative and productive people more likely to be bipolar? If you're creative in the first place and you go through at least a hypomanic episode, does that help you be more productive? And it's fascinating. There's a couple of recent books, these anthologies of 30 chapters, duking it out. Does mental illness help to produce creativity and productivity, or is it really kind of illusory? And there are researchers with strong opinions either side. I'm reminded of when I was an intern back here, and there was an international symposium that the Affective Disorders Clinic put on. Mike Gitlin and Kay Jameson, and they brought in Moen Scow and many other people. And what we learned about how to communicate the facts of bipolar disorder, and Professor Scow gave an important talk about a study he'd done of artists in Denmark and Scandinavia, many of whom had bipolar disorder and were very afraid of taking their lithium because it would squelch their creativity. But in fact, the vast majority of those surveyed said that I thought I was more creative without the treatment, but I could never complete a project. And things turned chaotic. And even though I might have been a little more slow in plotting on the medication, my artistic work has actually become better because now I can complete things. So I think there's a myth of creative genius in madness, and we should never treat, and there would have never been Shakespeare, there would have never been Van Gogh, and some of that is romanticization. But we can't discount the evolutionary fact that what? Why has bipolar disorder stayed in the gene pool? Or schizophrenia? If it were uniformly a terrible thing, it would have bred itself out of existence. And so maybe having a few genes, but not all of them, is protective. It's true for sickle cell. If you're a carrier, you are more immune to malaria. If you're a double recessive, you have sickle cell anemia. So partial loadings, heterozygote superiority, what mental illness is in an evolutionary sense, we've really just begun to touch upon.
Thank you. Yeah. One thing you wrote about a bit in your book, Steve, was the concept of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And there are so many inter-individual differences that really are not necessarily on the full spectrum of mental disorder,
Right.
But do represent differences in socialization, social ability, different kinds of emotional capacities. How do you perceive attitudes and stigma with regard to sort of the diversity of interpersonal skills and interpersonal relatedness?
Yeah, fascinating question. And I mean, we used to think that people with mental illnesses were in separate categories, and most everybody else was normal. The research evidence shows that with maybe one or two very rare exceptions, I mean, either you were an autistic kid or you weren't. There's autism spectrum disorders. There's the bipolar spectrum, the schizophrenia spectrum. Above a certain point, you have enough symptoms and impairment to be diagnosed, but the science is showing that everybody's on a continuum of a jillion traits and cognitive and emotional abilities. And so when do you have enough of those in the wrong kind of switch to get diagnosed? Maybe if true neurodiversity were more at everybody's fingertips, everybody would feel more connected and more vulnerable themselves, and stigma might be reduced. But it's not been an easy sell so far. I think it's a fascinating perspective that might have some legs as we go forward.
Right. Okay. One interesting question, and sort of related to the whole stigma, is the question of stigma is how and when to go about talking about a mental disorder. I mean, obviously, you've been very open and disclosing this evening, as has Robin in her introduction. One interesting question came up of, do you have any advice or recommendations about disclosure of mental illness during a job interview or application process?
I'm all for disclosure and coming out, but it's about timing and support. Americans with Disabilities Act just had its 25th anniversary. George H.W. Bush. Discrimination against physical or mental disability is outlawed in the workplace and in public by federal law. How many lawsuits for mental illness discrimination are brought up under ADA? Under 4%. It's expensive to put a ramp in or build a new bathroom. It's not very expensive, isn't it, for an employer to have somebody on flex time or maybe an hour off, spend an hour later, but an hour off to see your shrink at noon. But people don't bring it up because of stigma. Yeah, maybe if I've got the job under ADA, I could bring suit, but I would have never got the job in the first place if the first thing I told my boss is, I'm crazy, right? Timing is everything. The people who, Patrick Corrigan in Chicago and others, talk a lot about this, say, we need to end the silence and shame, but know your own level of comfort with disclosure, have a support network, choose your battles around employment as to when and where and if you have a job, and I think you have to be strategic.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting, because I remember after Kay wrote her book at one point, I said, So when did you decide you could come out and talk about being bipolar? I think it was a very difficult decision for her. When did you decide that you were going to come out and really talk about your dad and your family history? Like
a lot of things, it builds gradually over time. It wasn't I woke up one day and said, aha. For years I'd been thinking, Dad's story is pretty interesting. It's got a lot of historical stuff in it. Stigma against mental illness in society, people he got to know as a grad student. But I can't really talk about this. I mean, maybe I'd be unfit to be a clinical psychologist. There's a lot of professional stigma. Or do I have to have tenure first? I didn't really think about that, but it was an issue. And once I started opening up more to friends and family, stigma begets stigma and disclosure begets disclosure, it became easier, and in a kind of ascending curve, I thought, let's just go for it. This is part of who I am and who my family is.
So you have kids?
Yeah, 3 boys.
Hey, small world. So,
right.
So how have the discussions with them gone in terms of the family history? How have you shared all of this with them?
Well, let's go back. During my 20s, I thought I was never going to have kids. The genetic risk is too large. And then I started to think, yeah, but genes aren't everything, and I kind of want to be a dad. And once you kind of feel more confident in who you are, you forget about some of the myths and fears. And so with 2 boys in their 20s, 1 boy who's an early teenager, and I vowed that we're going to be open about stuff and not repeat the Columbus, Ohio family I grew up in. But that doesn't mean that the second they were old enough to hear a story, they heard about grandpa in mental hospitals. You've got to titrate it. You've got to be honest. And I remember our oldest one day, he's 8 or 9, and he was saying, I visit grandpa, but you're starting to talk and write about this, and what does mania mean? And I remember thinking, what's an 8-year-old boy going to think? And I talked about, what's the most excited you've ever been? Was it our trip to Disneyland? Was it? Can you imagine being that excited squared? Can you imagine being that excited and you couldn't get yourself not excited? The same with sadness. I was groping. You find language that kids at that developmental stage might get and try to make it real and have them imagine a little bit. And then the point is, once you start talking, it's not one discussion. You come back to it again and again, and you build, I think, trust, and you build some openness. Yeah.
Speaking of families and trust and discussions, one interesting question is, in terms of the importance of factors in outcome and successfully coping with illness, where would you rank family support in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of successfully coping with illness and recovery, getting back?
So where is family support on the sort of hierarchy of positive things, resilience-promoting factors? It's way up there. Can some people do it with dissolved families? Yes, but it's much harder. Your family is your primary source of communication about the world, transmission of cultural values, physical and emotional support when you most need it. And if it's too shameful to talk about with family members, my experience, professionally ordered, it's probably going to be too dangerous to talk about it with anybody else. And so this is why family therapy and psychoeducation and overcoming the silence, sometimes different forms of mental illness are going to get. They're going to need medication or individual therapy. Even if family therapy is not the primary treatment, it's going to be an adjunct to make sure that the primary treatments for condition X get enacted. And they're going to be the family members being there through thick and thin. So just going to go off on a tangent. How are people with mental health issues portrayed in the media? Villains, killers, or superheroes? John Nash, A Beautiful Mind. Yeah, he was schizophrenic, but damn, he won the Nobel Prize. And where's everybody in the middle? If it's all one way or all the other, where are the stories of everyday coping and struggle that if you were a novelist, you'd write about it, and some novelists do. If you're putting out an HBO documentary, which some do, It's the everyday struggles and trials and triumphs that families can support, and so they're way up on the hierarchy, and the more families talk about it, the more we erode the stigma that's pervasive in society. Same with, breast cancer. Did you watch Aaron Rodgers wearing pink wristbands and all the NFL guys 2 Sundays a week? The NFL being in support of breast cancer, it's a sea change. It's okay to talk about it. It's a real illness. It's our moms and girlfriends and wives and sisters, and we still don't do that with mental illness. We're not there yet.
One question that comes up sort of along these lines is, it would seem that a lot of this work has to happen in the school system.
Yeah.
You were talking about after-school clubs, you
Yeah.
were talking about ways to get young people's attitude to change, which sound a whole lot better than Latin Club, I would agree with you.
Right.
So what can we do, where are we at in California to get more knowledge and education in the school system for kids about mental disorder?
I think we're very far away. We don't have enough recess in schools. We're trying to do Common Core, which of course is a bad word. I think it's a great way to teach kids concepts behind what they're learning, but where in the curriculum is there downtime, especially as you go up to middle school and high school, and people are competing for the ridiculously low number of college admission slots and cramming for the SATs, and in some of the other work I do, taking ADHD medications because they'll make everybody smarter, and really dangerous things like that. There's not a lot of main school curriculum time for social skills development for young kids or for attitude change in older kids. Some schools do this in some electives, but that's why we're doing Let's as a sort of after-school club. There's no place in the curriculum for it right now. Yeah.
We could go on for quite some time this evening.
Well, we planned on that. We're going to come back after the break.
But I do want to leave time for you to be out in the foyer and talk to people and also sign books. But before we close, a couple of things. First, I really want to thank Robin for starting off the evening. Your courage in telling your story is just wonderful. I can't wait to see your book. So, thank you very much for getting us started. Steve, thank you for coming again to speak with us here. Fascinating talk, really important topic. I really appreciate your coming down. And to all of you, thanks for coming out. I hope you're enjoying the season of open minds that we started this year. We have a very busy fall schedule. Please visit our website and take a look at upcoming programs. We're able to hold these programs free and open to the public because of your generous support, because you join the Friends, because you give quite generously. For those of you who are members already, we really appreciate your continued support. Please pick up an envelope in the foyer. Take a moment to help us keep the doors open and continue to support these programs. Many thanks to the board of the Friends, to our president who got out of speaking tonight and gave me the job. Thank you for really continuing to think of these wonderful programs that we're able to put on here. Many thanks. Have a great evening, and we'll see you out in the foyer.